Okay boomer is not a slur, and anyone who thinks that it is a slur needs to have a bit more perspective. Okay boomer has sort of risen in prominence in the last couple weeks as mainstream media has picked up on the trend that was started by a lot of Gen Z young people on places like TikTok. And since then, there's been a lot of backlash from boomers who suggest that we're slurring them, that we're discriminating against them, that we're treating them poorly by using the phrase okay boomer. And even some media figures like Bob Lonsberry have gone so far to compare okay boomer to the N-word, to basically say that it is the N-word of ageist insults and slurs, which is absolutely balderdash. In no way can you compare the term okay boomer to the term N-word. In no way can you compare a term that's used to poke fun at an older generation to one that is associated with deep, deep systemic racism, the institution of slavery, and on and on and on. To make that comparison is absolutely absurd. And while Lonsberry was very rightly called out by pretty much everyone for making that comparison, many, many people still feel that okay boomer is not an okay phrase to say. But I want to talk about why it's a legitimate phrase and why a lot of boomers need to realize that it expresses a legitimate form of frustration that young people are feeling towards their generation. First, it needs to be said that this does not refer to boomers on an individual level. This is not referring to each and every single boomer. Every person born between the mid-1940s and the early 1960s. So it's not to say that, you are a boomer and therefore you are bad and us young people blame you and hate you and on and on and on. It's more to say that the boomer generation, significant segments of that generation, have caused economic and social and political hardship for the generation that followed it and for the generations that have followed it, in a way that the boomer generation did not face from its parents or grandparents. The parents and grandparents of boomers left a better world for the boomers, and the boomers have left a worse world for their children and their grandchildren. And that fundamentally is the issue at play here. The boomer generation took a hot economy, took cheap forms of education, took high levels of social equality and mobility, and tore much of that down. And while not every boomer voted for policies that have hurt young people, that have hurt Gen X, millennials, and Zoomers, at the end of the day, their generation on aggregate did those things and have made lives harder for young people. It is not a slur to note that historical and contemporary fact. Further to that, okay boomer is less an insult levied towards individual boomers, but rather an expression about how boomers fail to understand and fail to sympathize with the concerns that young people have in today's social and political and economic context. That's fundamentally important. It's not just that boomers on aggregate made life harder for young people because they didn't do enough to fight for affordable education, how they allowed pensions and unions to stagnate, how they failed to do enough to start the battle against climate change, and on and on and on. It's also that when young people bring up their challenges, boomers just explain them away as young people are lazy, or young people are impatient, or young people are indulgent, or young people are materialistic, and all the other sorts of negative aspects that have been levied towards Gen Z and millennials by boomer media, by boomer memes, by boomer Facebook groups, and so on. And so when young people suggest to these older folks, when young people suggest to boomers that, hey, this isn't the kind of economy anymore where you can succeed in most cases with just a high school diploma. This isn't the economy anymore where university was really, really, really cheap. And you can start a life in your early 20s with minimal debt and, go into a good job that has security and pensions and benefits. That doesn't exist for the vast majority of young people these days in a way that it did for a lot of boomers. Not all boomers, but a lot of boomers. It's not the sort of economy where wages are keeping pace with the core costs of life. It's not the sort of economy where one income can support multiple people. It's just not that kind of economy anymore. And again, we understand that not all boomers supported the drive towards a more unequal and precarious society. And we also recognize that not all boomers live this grand, prosperous life. But we are asking boomers to understand that all things being equal, it is harder for young people to succeed with similar levels of training and education and effort than it was for the boomer generation. And if they can't see that, and if they continue to suggest that it's because we're lazy, or it's because we're impatient, or it's because we're impulsive, or it's because we buy too much avocado toast, or it's because of our iPhones or Android phones or what have you, then we will respond by saying, okay, boomer. Because at the end of the day, we can provide all the anecdotes, we can provide all the statistics, we can provide all the evidence as to why our lives are harder now than they were for boomers on average. But if boomers fail to recognize that and instead resort to the fact that it's our fault, then we're going to respond with an okay boomer type phrase, because at the end of the day, it's not worth the energy arguing with you folks. If you're a boomer who does that, you deserve to just have that curt response, because you've shown you're unwilling to wrestle with the reality as it exists. There's a lot of boomers out there. Again, not all boomers, but there's a disproportionate amount of boomers out there who feel that they've earned everything they have, and that young people today who don't have the same sort of thing have simply not worked hard enough or smart enough for it, and that it's their fault. But boomers need to realize that macroeconomic conditions are often far, far, far more important than the individual efforts of a given person or even persons. Put another way, boomers need to realize that their circumstances were in large part based on luck and being in the right place at the right time, having free education or cheap education, having good access to social services, having jobs that paid a good wage even without a high school diploma. These are the sorts of things that are quickly becoming rarities, if they still exist at all, for my generation and for the next generation. And so any boomer that looks at that reality and continues to insist that we just don't work hard enough as a generation deserves to hear the phrase, okay, boomer.